your lecture, I would like to introduce you to our participants.
Sure.
Taking your permission, sir.
Yeah, sure, sure.
Uh, Somoda, are you there?
Yeah, yeah.
Please
Am I?
introduce our research person.
Okay, okay. Am I audible? Pothik, just confirm if I am audible or not.
Yes, yes, you are audible.
Thank you so much. Uh, Good morning and a hearty welcome to all the participants to the 7th day of the web lecture series organized jointly by Departments of English, Kharagpur College and EGRA Association. On behalf of the organizers, it is my pleasure to welcome our esteemed speaker for Dr. Annoy Mukhopadhyay. Dr. Annoy Mukhopadhyay is a renowned scholar and academician who has several research articles, book reviews, review chapters under his name, published in several renowned journals such as News India, The Critical Reviewer. His thesis is reflected in the two books he has authored, namely Indrana, the daughter of Zeus, and After the Three Eyes. Dr. Mukhopadhyay is also the recipient of various prestigious accolades, such as the Indira Gandhi Priyadarshini Award for outstanding achievements in the field of English literature. He has worked in the Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and Department of English and Culture Studies, University of Burdwan. Presently, he is working as an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Kharagpur. The topic he will be speaking on today is titled, What is a Classic and How to Read It? Without further I invite and hand over the platform to Dr. Mukhopadhyay to begin this much awaited session.
Thank you for introducing me. So I think without further ado, we can start the program now. So I would be speaking on what is a classic and how to read it. Now, the reason why I have chosen this particular topic is that when we think about the classics today, we are faced with certain problems, certain problems regarding the basic epistemologies of literary criticism, which have always focused on literary excellence, the quality of literature, what is good literature and what is bad literature, and all these things. Now, as you all probably know, today it's not really very easy to identify one text as a good text and another text as a bad text. There are two problems. So one is related to the marketplace where the literary texts are being circulated. For instance, if you think about the market of literature, the market where literature is bought and sold. For instance, if you think about the big publishing houses which publish literary texts and then sell them, market them, then you find that the market is to a great extent instrumental in identifying a piece of literature as good literature or bad literature. Okay, so the problem is that today we have to take into account this issue of the market economy, the global market of literature, which determines which kind of literature is going to be sold and which kind of literature is going to be suppressed even. For instance, if you think about the policies of publishing that are taken up by any reputed, global publisher of fiction or poetry or whatever, you will find that they have certain policies regarding selling literature. So it's not just about understanding and appreciating the quality of literature, but also about understanding the potential sellability of a text. Okay, so that is one problem. The other problem is, of course, that is a problem, but I will not say that it's a problem in a negative sense, but rather it's a problem in a positive sense as well, because it is something which problematizes the very concept of a classic, the very concept of literary excellence, and all these things. That is the issue of relativity, cultural relativity, and also to some extent the issue of intercultural understanding. Okay, so for instance, today we can no longer say that one text is absolutely great and another text is absolutely bad. And that's why when you find a book like the Western Canon by Harold Bloom, you find that Bloom, in a somewhat conservative way, is trying hard to hold on to those ideas of literary excellence which were prevalent in earlier times. Okay. And that's why he is angry with the idea of in terms of canon making. We all know that whatever we study in the field of literary studies is actually part of the literary canon. So whenever we think about the syllabus that is prepared in any university, any college, or whatever, in any educational institution, you need to understand that this syllabus is grounded in the logic of canon formation, the formation of a literary canon. Okay, so what is a literary canon? The literary canon is the repertoire of chosen texts, so the texts which have been chosen as great texts, as good texts over the years, over the decades, and even over the centuries. Now, earlier, the idea was that whatever was old was wonderful, or whatever was held to be great for centuries was great, and whatever was not held to be wonderful was not wonderful. So that kind of absolutist idea about goodness and badness of texts used to prevail. But we all know that that kind of absolutism is no longer tenable, because we are now much more sort of responsive to the issues of cultural relativity. And we know that something which may appear to be not so good from the perspective of one culture may appear to be quite good from the perspective of another culture. And this is something which we need to understand while talking about the classic today, because in a way it is very difficult even to hold on to the idea of a classic today. And there are certain critics, for instance, there is Christopher Pendergast, who and Pendergast in his book titled The Classic says that whenever we think about the classics today, we have to be aware of the threat of conservatism, which is often associated with the very idea of a classic. Okay, I will come to that gradually. But before moving over to the lecture itself, I would like to briefly talk about the structure of the lecture that I have thought of. First, I would talk about what is a classic. So the very idea of a classic, how can you define it, or is it at all definable? So all these issues will be taken up in this particular segment of the lecture. Then I will be talking about the ways of reading a classic. Okay, and how the previously sort of celebrated ways of reading a classic are no longer tenable, how we need to develop new ways of reading a classic, how our attitudinal sort of perspective needs to be shifted from the earlier attitudes that the literary critics used to have towards a classic, and all these things. And then finally, I would sort of focus on a much more tricky issue, that is how to write a classic. Now, of course, it may sound a bit bizarre and absurd to you, because of course, in that segment, I am not going to really talk about the ways in which you can write a classic. So it would not be really an instruction about writing a classic, but rather it would be something which would be grounded in the experiences of the great authors, the experiences of writing. So we are more often than not talking about the classics from the perspective of readers, from the perspective of an informed reader, an intellectual reader, or from a lay reader probably. That is exactly how the classic has been seen through ages. But in the last segment of my lecture, I would like to focus a little bit on the writer's perspective on writing something great. Okay, so that would be a somewhat writer-centric approach, not really a biographical kind of approach, which is in a way passe, but it would rather focus on the experience of writing a great text. Okay, that a great writer has shared with us. Many writers have shared with us the experience of writing great texts. Okay, texts that have later on become classics. So the last part of this lecture would briefly focus on that. Now, first, let's come to this point. What is a classic? As I have told you, the very problem with the idea of a classic is that etymologically, the idea of classic is associated with the idea of class. Okay, so of course, there is some kind of hierarchical, structure involved in the very conception of a classic. So the moment we talk about a classic, we consciously or unconsciously hint at some kind of hierarchy. Maybe sometimes we are not doing this consciously, but nevertheless, some kind of perception of a hierarchy is there, okay, in our unconscious whenever we are thinking about a classic. For instance, if you think about the French and Latin terms, which are associated with the concept of the classic. So the French classic, CLASSIQUE, or the Latin classes, classicus, etc. These are associated with the concept of class or division. Okay, so the moment we're talking about a classic, we are actually talking about some kind of class division, okay, in terms of the literary texts. Now, so long as these class divisions are made only on the basis of literary excellence, probably there is some kind of utility of this kind of classification. But more often than not, what happens is that the moment a culture is forming its literary canon, we find that that culture is also reflecting its social political hierarchies in the construction of its literary canon. So this is something we need to remember very carefully. Okay. In other words, the formation of a canon or the conceptualization of a classic, a literary classic, is not actually politically innocent. There is some kind of politics involved in that, and we have to acknowledge that. There's no point in saying that literature is all about imaginative universe making and so on and so forth. There is, of course, a reflection of the politics and the social hierarchies that are prevalent in any given society at any given point of time. So that's there. But having said that, I must also raise an issue here. Is it really the case that literary excellence is not a matter of literary excellence or imaginative feat, but rather just a matter of political power? This is again a question which keeps troubling us. And if you think about the critics, the writers, the social theorists who are talking about the close connection between politics and literature, even they have to acknowledge that there are indeed certain texts which are wonderful, which are great texts. For instance, if you think about Greenblatt, Stephen Greenblatt has great admiration for Shakespearean texts. Okay, so in Shakespeare's texts, he finds something wonderful. It's not the case that he just finds a kind of, a reflection of the political hierarchies of Elizabethan or Jacobean England. It's not just that. He is well aware and he's acutely aware of the excellence of Shakespeare's texts. So even when we talk about the problematic connection between politics and literature, we simultaneously do get to understand that there are certain texts which are great, and their greatness has to be acknowledged. Their greatness is acknowledged by everybody. Okay, but again, who are these everybody? This is again another very important question. For instance, who are going to enjoy and appreciate the excellence of a classic? Is it really the lay people who are going to enjoy that, or is it the informed, educated people? Okay, so as far as the reader-centric approach to the classic is concerned, we need to question whether indeed all the readers, the lay readers as well as the informed readers, are able to enjoy a classic. Okay, so that is a very important issue. We often tend to say that a classic is something which is enjoyed by all, but is it really the case? Is it really the case that everybody enjoys a classic? And even if everybody enjoys a classic, is it the case that everybody enjoys a classic in the same way? That is actually not the case. As we know, for instance, yeah, if an adolescent person reads Romeo and Juliet, then that person would read it in one way. And if, say, an aged person reads it, he or she would read it in a different way. So even when we are talking about the universal appeal of a classic text, we need to understand that the text is not received by everybody in a similar way. Okay, or in a universal way. So even though there may be a universal appeal of a text, there would be differences in terms of its reception by different kinds of readers. Now, then let's come to again a classic, a quote-unquote classic essay on the classics that was by Saint-Beuve, and it was called "What is a Classic?" So in this 1850 essay, "What is a Classic?", Saint-Beuve comes up with certain ideas about a classic. Let me briefly read out some of the things which he says about the classic in that essay. He says that a true classic is an author who has enriched the human mind, increased its treasure, and caused it to advance a step. According to Saint-Beuve, the classic is something which would reveal some eternal passion in that heart where all seemed known and discovered. And it would have a style which is found to be also that of the whole world. A style new without neologism, new and old, easily contemporary with all time. Now, if you closely analyze these statements regarding a classic made by Saint-Beuve, you find that he is actually providing you with a series of paradoxical statements. Okay, so a classic is something which is at once new and perennial. Okay, so it is new, but it is not something which appears to you to be dropping from the sky. Okay, for the first time in the history of the cosmos, it's not like that. So it is something which, as it were, sort of reminds you of something which has always been there. So it is new in that it sort of sensitizes you in a very novel way to something which has always been there. Okay. So it enriches the human mind, but that doesn't mean that it creates something out of the void, something which was not there, which was never there, and then it sort of gives you with that. But rather, it enriches the human mind by energizing and activating its perceptual sort of faculty, its sort of capacity for understanding the universe, its capacity for appreciating life in a new way, of course. It increases the treasure and it causes to advance the human mind a step. So implicitly, there is again the idea of culture and the civilizational sort of advancement which is involved here. So these ideas, according to Christopher Pendergast, are associated with a very conservative idea about culture, a conservative idea of culture, which says that culture is something which is opposed to barbarism, okay, and which also implicitly puts forward the idea that the cultured people are sort of better than the not so cultured people. So there is a kind of social hierarchy which is implied by this kind of conservative concept of culture, and it is of course problematic. But nevertheless, for the time being, let's focus just on what he says about a classic. So he says that it reveals some eternal passion in that heart where all seemed known and discovered. So probably you as a lay reader think that everything is known to you, and there is nothing unfamiliar, okay, which is being provided by a piece of literature, a common piece of literature, but a classic is something which will make you understand that there is something unfamiliar in the midst of what you have always held to be so familiar to you. Okay, so what is known and what seems to be known and discovered suddenly begins to sort of see a fruition of an eternal passion which has always been there but which was not perceived by you. So in a way, what Soundview is saying is quite akin to the concept of defamiliarization that the Russian formalists came up with. This concept of defamiliarization, as you probably know, says that great literature, or even literature in general, tries to defamiliarize language. So when we use language at an everyday basis, on the basis of our everyday usage of language, there is some kind of monotony associated with that use of language. There is some kind of diminishing of language in terms of its creative and imaginative potential. But when, on the other hand, a piece of literature is written, the so-called familiar language, the language which appeared to be familiar, which appeared to be just a matter of everyday use, suddenly becomes a very new thing. Okay, it's used in a very new way, and that is the process of defamiliarization. So language is defamiliarized through literary creation, and that is exactly what he is saying. He's saying that the classic would have a style which would appear to be unique. So again, here you have another paradox. The style of a classic text would be a unique style which would reflect the imaginative potential of its author, but at the same time, it would also be the style of the whole world. Okay, now let me give you a kind of example which would not be probably a very good example, but nevertheless it would be a workable example in this context. If you think about Joyce's works like Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses, you will find that when he is experimenting too much with language, probably this aspect of a classic is missing from his text. For instance, when he is writing Finnegan's Wake, it is much more experimental than Ulysses. Okay. So if we are to follow Soundview's concept of a classic, then can we say that Finnegan's Wake is not a classic in the sense Ulysses is a classic because Ulysses also experiments with the style, but probably that experimentation is not in war with the style of the whole world, to quote Soundview. Okay, so again, that would be a question. I'm not saying that Finnegan's Wake is not a classic and Ulysses is, but we may raise this question. And interestingly, the same kind of issue was raised by Nabanita Devshen. Probably some of you would be familiar with her name. She was a comparative literature specialist. So Nabanita Devshen wrote an essay on Kamal Kumar Majumdar. Kamal Kumar Majumdar was actually deeply influenced by Proust and Joyce. And in Kamal Kumar Majumdar's Bengali novels, you find a reflection of the style, the sort of chaotically, almost chaotically deconstructive style of Joyce and Proust. So while writing on Kamal Kumar Majumdar's texts, Nabanita Devshen said that while many Bengali authors used to hail Kamal Kumar as a classic, she would not do so because she said, just like Soundview, that a classic is something which should be understandable to everybody. So it should be, it should have a universal kind of intelligibility. So in other words, again, the concept of Soundview that the style of the unique style of a classic should nevertheless also be the style of the whole world. And it is again something, according to Soundview, which is easily contemporary with all time. That is to say, it is never going to grow old. It is something which always remains new. So it is not something which just suddenly appears as a new thing, but rather it is something which will be contemporary with all time. Now here I would like to introduce the concept of the Chironobin by Rabindranath Tagore. That concept given by Rabindranath Tagore, the concept of the Chironobin. So Tagore, while talking about literary modernity and literary modernism, both in the West and in Bengali literature, talks about the importance of holding on to the principle of what he calls the chironobin, okay, something which is ever new. So Tagore says that when you think about literary modernity as something which just experiments with very new, unique, sort of jarring styles, then you are probably not getting the point. But rather, true adhunikata or modernity should be something which should be grounded in the principle of the chironobin, and great literature should be always new. It should never grow old. Okay, so it's not the case that at one point of time, in one period of in one period of the literary history of a culture, you have something which is extremely novel, and then in the next phase of that literary history, that particular style becomes stale, that particular style becomes passe. If that happens, then that is not really great literature, not even adhunik, according to Tagore. So Tagore would say that the principle of the chironobin, or the ever new, is something which should guide our concept of literary excellence. And interestingly, this idea was also there in Soundview. Let me now move over to some other possible, definitions of the classic, or certain other possible characteristics of a quote-unquote classic that have been identified by authors as well as critics. As far as this concept of chironobin or ever new or whatever, this kind of idea is concerned, that that great literature or a classic piece of literature is going to give you pleasure at every reading. This is, interestingly, a perennial idea about a classic, okay, in the Western literary culture. For instance, if you read Michael Didder's book, Bound to Please, Didder actually won the Pulitzer Prize in 1993. You find that he's saying that literature, a classic piece of literature, is something which can be read again and again with ever-deepening pleasure. Okay, so when you read it for the second time, it's not that your pleasure of reading is diminished, but rather you get probably more pleasure than you got while reading it for the first time. Okay, that's the idea. Interestingly, as opposed to this idea, there is a very interesting and very humorous kind of take on classic that you find in Mark Twain. Mark Twain, in his Disappearance of Literature lecture in 1900, this was actually a speech that he delivered at the New York Press Club dinner, and he delivered this speech at the annual dinner in November 1900. In that lecture, Twain, in his characteristically humorous way, said that a classic is something that everyone wants to have read, and nobody actually wants to read. Okay, so for instance, there are many classics which, as we know, it's not really very comfortable probably for all the lay readers to read. For instance, just think about War and Peace. Okay, now when you are reading War and Peace, I mean, it's quite possible that a lay reader would be put off by the sheer volume of that book. Okay, it's a huge book. So I mean, should I really be interested in reading this huge book? So according to Mark Twain, a classic is something that everyone wants to have read. So probably everyone would be desirous of having read it, so that they can claim the cultural capital which is associated with a classic, with the reading of a classic. But nevertheless, one is not actually willing to read a classic, according to Mark Twain. Okay, and this is, as we know, something which has to be acknowledged. Throughout the history of humankind, certain people have celebrated literary classics, but that really doesn't mean that everyone has read classics or everyone has found the classics mind-blowing. It's not really like that. And in the contemporary times, after the emergence of the audiovisual media, particularly the emergence of cinema. In the 20th and 21st centuries, you need to understand that there has been a significant shift in terms of reading classics. Many of us actually see the film adaptations of classic texts, classic literary texts, but we don't really get back to the book and read it out. Okay, that often happens to be the case. For instance, I remember when, on the other hand, the other thing is also possible. For instance, it's possible that a film is made out of a classic literary text, and then after seeing the film, even the lay viewer of the film would be interested in the book and will get back, okay, to the text, to the literary text. That is possible. Okay, so this kind of reverse journey from the film text to the literary text is also possible. But nevertheless, the general trend is to sort of see the films rather than reading the book, because you can probably finish seeing the film made out of a classic text in two and a half hours. But that is not the case with the book. Okay, for instance, when you see a film, the appeal is very direct, right? So you are directly seeing the things on the screen. But that is not the case while you read literature. You need to engage in the imaginative process of ideation when you read literature, as Iser and the others would say. So, but here I would like to pause for a moment and raise another significant question. That is, can we now, I mean, from today's perspective, think about an alternative way of reading the classic? And now I am entering the issue of how to read it. I mean, can we really try to look at the alternative ways of reading a classic? For instance, the intermediate way of reading a classic. When I am seeing a film that is made out of a classic, can that act of seeing the film be seen as an act of reading, receiving the classic text in an intermediate way? For instance, it was written as a literary text, but I am seeing this as a film. Can we say that this is also a kind of reading, an intermediate reading, probably a kind of mediated reading? Of course, there would be a lot of mediation. For instance, it's quite possible that the filmmaker has interpreted the text in a new way, and that's why his film is not really the same as the literary text of the author. There is a difference between the author's perspective and the filmmaker's perspective. As we know, that often happens, and every time a classic, a classic book is made into a film, there is a debate regarding the authenticity of the film. Okay, how closely it follows the structure of the original text, whether it deviates from the basic ideological and sort of cultural assumptions of the text or not, etc. But I would like to throw this question to all of you. I mean, whether can we, whether we can see this as a way of reading a text, but in a different way, in an intermediate way. So there is a shift between the two media. On the other hand, we also need to think about another issue in this particular context. I shouldn't probably use the expression "on the other hand" because it is actually sort of in continuation with what I have just said. This concept of the possible concept of an intermediate way of reading a classic. That is the question of reading a classic through translation. Now, this is a very significant issue because whenever we talk about world classics, we talk about classics written in many languages. Now, one person may be a polyglot, but being a polyglot is not a very common thing. Okay, everyone is not capable of reading and understanding and speaking multiple languages, right? So we need to understand that as far as the average readers are concerned, even the readers of literature, even the the readers who are working within the literary academia, even they, when we think about them, we need to acknowledge that most of them are not really polyglot. Probably they know only 2 languages or 2 or 3 languages maximum. So should we say that a classic doesn't remain a classic, doesn't remain what it is really, what it really is? When it is translated into a different language, there are certain linguistic fundamentalists who would say that it is really the case, that when you translate great poetry or even great fiction into a different language, that classic is no more a classic, okay, because you completely miss the charm of the original. But if one is being so obsessed with with the sort of purity of the original, quote unquote original, then there is a trouble, there is a practical trouble, because then that text, which is a classic in one language, will not be available as a classic to the speakers of other languages. And if that is the case, then you are actually limiting the potential of that text as a classic. Okay. For instance, how many of us read Homer in the original Greek? Okay. How many of us read Stadal in the original language? Okay, in which it was written. I mean, in which he wrote. But when we think about classics in translation, we need to understand that in most of the cases, the world classics, the excellent literary texts, which are really part of the repertoire of the the literary repertoire of the human civilization as a whole, most of those great texts reach the speakers of different languages in translation. So translation is also very important, and we can't really say that a classic loses its proper charm when it's translated, because we need to understand that even though it loses its charm, it's quite possible that it loses a lot of its charm when it's translated. For instance, if you think about Tagore's Gitanjali, a whole sort of series of debates are there regarding the quality of Tagore's own translation, Tagore's or rather transcreation of his Bengali poems into English poems. And there is a huge debate regarding the quality of Tagore's translation, whether the translated texts, the translated poems in the English Gitanjali, in the song offerings, really sort of embody the quality, the wonderful quality of Tagore's Bengali poems or not. But we need to understand that even though there are certain flaws in Tagore's own translation, even that quote-unquote flawed text could appeal to the entire world. Okay, so translation is a very effective medium for carrying a classic from one cultural and linguistic ecosystem to other cultural and linguistic ecosystems. And this journey, this cross-cultural and intercultural journey, is very important. This is something which we need to celebrate. Okay, and this is the case with every classic. Okay, a classic. And here probably we need to sort of pause again and think about another issue. Is it the case that the universal appeal of a classic, or the universal style that Sandeep was talking about, is it something which also requires a classic to be continuously translatable? In a way, it does. Okay, and when I talk about translation in this context, I'm also thinking about the larger connotations of cultural translation. Okay, cultural translation is something which would ensure a never-ending afterlife of the text. Okay, so now we come to another very interesting idea about the classic that was put forward by Italo Calvino in his essay, Why Read the Classics? And this essay was published in the New York Review of Books in 1986. In this essay, Calvino says that a classic is a book that has never finished saying what it has to say. And here we come to the issue of continuous translatability, continuous possibility of transforming and reworking the classic. Okay, so now you need to understand that a classic as a linguistic construct does say what it has got to say. Okay, so when you think about a classic as a material object, a book from page number 1 to page number, say, 349, that book, in terms of the linguistic science and also in terms of the linguistic sort of act act, in terms of being a linguistic act, that text probably says what it has got to say. But what is not finished within the scope of that material or functional sort of sphere is its implication, its connotations, its possibility, its ability to speak to different generations of readers, new generations of readers. Okay, and that is why Calvin says that a classic is a book that has never finished saying what it has to say. So when we think about this issue of perenniality, a classic being a perennial text, having a universal appeal and a perennial appeal, then we need to understand that probably it's not just something which is metaphysical in nature, which is time transcending and space transcending, but rather it's something which is able to stage a dialogue with multiple generations of readers. And that is why the way Shakespeare's own audience used to see his plays is not the way we now see his plays, right? So our perspective is very different. So with every new generation, our approach to the classic changes drastically. Then Calvino also talks about the universal dimension. He says that, in fact, something which is very interesting. He says that the classic is almost equivalent to the universe itself. There is something talismanic about a classic. It, as it were, in a small sort of sphere within the limited scope of its sort of linguistic utterances, it nevertheless embodies the entire universe. Okay, so there is something. So in a way, a classic is a microcosm for the entire universe. That's what Calvino means to say. And then he says that you can't be indifferent to the classic author. You may quarrel with the classic author, you may refuse to agree with the classic author, but nevertheless, you can't ignore him or her. You can't be indifferent to the classic author. And then he says something which appears very relevant today, because even though he was writing this in 1986, the concerns which he raised are still quite relevant. He said that in the modern world, or to be more specific, probably in the late 20th century and in the early 21st century, the early 21st century is the temporal sort of framework that we are inhabiting. In this time, in this changed time, we are always faced with what Calvino calls in that essay the avalanche of current events. We are every day thinking about the current events. So our brains are getting crowded with the day-to-day problems. Okay, and that is all the more intense now thanks to the social media. So we are continuously thinking about what is happening outside, around ourselves. Now, in certain cases, this is seen as something positive. This is seen as something which is a marker of democracy, that you are well aware of the problems around you, the political problems, social problems, cultural problems, etc. But on the other hand, we need to question ourselves: are we really being acutely aware of the problems, or are we rather diluting our own capacity for cognizing, understanding, and properly giving an informed response to those problems? Okay, this is what Calvino meant to say. And he says in this essay that the classic relegates the concerns of the moment to the status of background noise, but it persists as a background noise even when the most troublesome contemporary concerns are in control. Now, this is a very interesting statement. This is a paradoxical statement, but this is an extremely interesting statement. He says that the classic would make you understand that what you take to be the most important concern of today is probably not the most important concern for humankind, because humankind has faced similar troubles in every phase of its cultural and political history. On the other hand, it will continue to haunt you like a specter even when everything is fine around you. Even when everything is fine around you, and you can just give a kind of status of the food that you are enjoying on Facebook, even then the classic will keep hunting you, and it will keep subconsciously telling you that there is some kind of some source of ingrained unhappiness in the human condition. Okay, so you have to be continuously concerned about that. So that's why when you read the Mahabharata, when you read the Odyssey, they stick to your subconscious as kinds of specters. So they keep haunting you even when you are you are apparently happy and you think that everything is happy around you. The classic would spectrally whisper to you that everything is not really fine. There is something which is eternally unstable about the human condition. So that is the message given by the Oedipus Rex. That's the message given by the Mahabharata. That's the message given by even the modern classics, the 20th century classics, like the works of Camus, for instance. Once you read the Plague, or when you read Kafka, you can never be the same person again. Okay, and this is what Adorno had also said, that when you have read Kafka, you can never remain the same person. There is something changed within you. Okay. Then let's come to this issue of reading it. When, in fact, even though I've said that I have sort of divided my lecture into 3 segments, they are interconnected. So probably, there will be cross references to all of these segments in my lecture. Now, when we talk about the ways of reading a classic, particularly the way of critically addressing a classic, we need to understand that today we can't read a classic critically in the way our previous generations, by our previous generations, I mainly mean the early 20th century scholars or critics, the way they used to read it. Okay. Now, as we know, there has been a great shift in terms of literary criticism in general. And we are now acutely aware of the fact that any piece of literature is essentially conditioned by the material conditions of its production. For instance, what kind of historical condition was there when the text was being produced, what kind of political ideas were there in the air, and so on and so forth. So this is something which we need to take care of. Now, it is not the case that everyone is happy with this approach. For instance, I've just talked about Harold Bloom. In fact, there are certain parts in that book, The Western Canon, where Bloom severely criticizes the contemporary ways of forming alternative literary canons, so where you give voice to the minority voices, where you give voice to the marginalized sort of communities. And he means to say basically that literary excellence is something which is universal and it should be understood in absolute terms. You should not employ other criteria. For instance, you should not say that this is a marginal community and that's why we need to canonize their texts. That's the point of Bloom. His point is that literary excellence is something which is universal and it can be objectively judged. Okay, so if a text is good, then no matter whether it is coming from a marginal community or the central community or a disempowered community or an empowered community, it is good. And if it's bad, then again, no matter whatever context it's coming from, it's bad. But we know that that is not really the case. For instance, so whenever we think about the canon formation, the politics of canon formation, we know that there is some kind of power always at work in the academia, in the literary academia, in the cultural sphere in general. And it is that power structure which determines what is going to be held as canonical and what is going to be pushed to the peripheries. So we need to be sensitive to this issue as well. Then I would say very strongly that when today we read a classic, we should not be overawed by the classic. Okay, so okay, I am reading Shakespeare and it's wonderful. Okay, so I should be overawed. It should not be like that. for years, for decades, for centuries, the literary establishment, unfortunately, has propped up the hierarchy of readers. It has always believed that when a reader, particularly a lay reader, probably, or a reader who doesn't have a significant amount of cultural capital within the academia, when that reader reads a text, for instance, say a student, okay, when such a reader reads a text, that reader is supposed to be overawed by a classic. So when you are reading Shakespeare, you are supposed to be awed by that text. Okay, you are not supposed to take the liberty of interpreting it in the way you wish. But I would strongly suggest that from today's perspective, we come to understand that that freedom is very important. It's extremely important to take that interpretive, freedom, that freedom to interpret a text in the way you wish. Of course, there are certain, codes which are universal. There are certain linguistic codes. So for instance, you can't say that if there is written cat in a text that you would interpret it as mat. You can't do that. So you are certainly conditioned by certain, certain material constraints. Okay, as far as a text is concerned, as far as a classic is concerned. So due to the very limited and limiting nature of any linguistic utterance, even though you may say that there is also something unlimited about our linguistic utterance, there are certain limitations which you will have to acknowledge. Okay, just as I said, you can't say that cat is going to be interpreted as mat. That is not possible. But nevertheless, interpretative freedom is very important. As far as reading a classic is concerned, we are not supposed to be afraid of a classic. Okay. So I am a lay reader. I am not a Shakespeare specialist. So how can I interpret Shakespeare in a new way? Okay, that's not what we are supposed to do. But rather, we are supposed to be courageous enough to deal with a classic just as we would deal with any other text. Okay, that's very important as far as the critical approach to a classic is concerned. And then finally, let me come to the question of the social dimension of a classic. So what is a classic, and what kind of classic should we think about when we think about world literature? Okay, for instance, if you think about the concept of classic from today's perspective, the perspective of cultural pluralism, you can no more say that the classics are confined to only one culture, only one language. You can't say that you are a student of English literature, so you are not going to read anything, any classic from French. A student of literature, whatever language he or she may operate within, a student of literature is supposed to appreciate and be familiar with multiple classics from multiple languages. Of course, as I said, I mean, translation is very important, but nevertheless, some kind of familiarity with the classics should be there, because after all, literature is a part of a polysystem, and literature is not something which can be studied in isolation. Okay, so one language, one literature, it's not like that. And that's why when Diderot writes in his Classics for Pleasure, that was published in 2008, that today we need to think about classics in multicultural terms, I think he does make a very significant point. And he includes Dracula, the Chinese, the classic Chinese texts, the Icelandic sagas, and so many texts, from different cultures in his list of world classics. And this approach was there in Sainte-Beuve too, because Goethe's concept of world literature was there in the air very much. But nevertheless, as Christopher Prendergast points out, later on, Sainte-Beuve moved from a kind of pluralist approach to the conceptualization of the classic to a nationalist and a much narrower conceptualization of the classic, and that is why Prendergast criticizes him. But Sainte-Beuve also said that there are not there is not just Homer as far as the classic epic poetry is concerned. There is also Valmiki, there is Vyasa, there is Ferdowsi. So he mentioned all these names. And he also said that when we think about the classics, we are not supposed to divide the human race in terms of different racial categories, but rather there should be a unified concept of world literature and a concept of literary excellence that transcends racial boundaries. And he also made a very interesting observation. He said that the ancient classics can happily converse with the modern ones. Okay, so it's not really the case that there is a disjuncture, a radical disjuncture between, on the one hand, on the one hand, he says that it's not really the case that there is a disjuncture between the ancient classics and the modern classics. Okay, so it's not really the case that there is no conversation possible between, say, a 20th century writer like Camus and Shakespeare, or say a 20th century writer like Kafka and Homer, and so on and so forth. And we know very well that indeed there is a continuum as far as the history of literature is concerned. Okay, there are multiple disjunctures, but there is also a continuum. And finally, I come to the issue of how to write a classic, or what kind of idea does an author have, what kind of experience does an author have when he or she writes a classic. Okay, but just before moving to that, I would briefly mention one theory. It's a very interesting theory, but it's not just a theory, it's a philosophical idea put forward by Robert Pirsig, who himself was a great creative author, and he's credited with writing one of the greatest philosophical novels of the 20th century, that is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Interestingly, Pirsig was a genius, there is no doubt about that, and Pirsig had a kind of huge knowledge about both Western and Eastern cultures. He came to Banaras University, he studied there, and then he went back to the USA. And in this particular book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, he comes up with a very interesting theory, that is metaphysics of quality, MOQ theory. Now, a lot of works have been done on that. But what is interesting in the context of talking about the classics is that, according to Pirsig, quality or value is something which is a kind of perceptual experience preceding academic construction of it. That is to say, he says that when you read something beautiful, you first immediately recognize it as something which is beautiful. Okay, and after that, you try to analyze the reasons for its being beautiful. Okay, that's his point. And he says that that is why we need to see quality as a pre-intellectual cutting edge of reality. He uses this phrase. This particular phrase, I'm repeating the phrase, he says that quality is pre-intellectual cutting edge of reality. Now, again, there is a problem with this issue, and someone was putting forward a question whether you can see the very concept of the classic as a kind of ideology. Of course, from one perspective, you can always see that as ideology, and you can even, dismiss Pirsig's idea of MOQ or metaphysics of quality as a kind of ideology. But then I would come up with a very practical issue, that is, is it really the case that the literary scholars or the students are not or should not be able to distinguish between good and bad? Now, this is a very important issue. Okay, I mean, from the perspective of radical cultural relativism, there is, of course, no difference between good and bad. There is no difference between what is excellent and what is not. Okay, but we need to ask ourselves very honestly, and this should be an honest question. Okay, and because this kind of question is nowadays seen as a question, as a marker of political incorrectness. But the problem is that we need to ask ourselves this question: that is not there, and should not there be a difference between what is really good and what is really bad? Now, you may question me. I mean, what do you mean by this term really? Of course, it's subjective. You can say that, and I have every right to say that I don't like Shakespeare. Of course, I can do that. Anyone can say that, he or she doesn't like Homer. We can't say that one doesn't have the right to dislike Shakespeare or Homer. But we also need to ask ourselves very honestly whether we indeed find a difference between what is good and what is bad. And I think in this context, the issue raised by Pirsig is very important, because when we recognize something as good, when we recognize something as beautiful, then that moment of recognition is in a way pre-intellectual, though I will not completely agree with this idea that this is pre-intellectual, because there is also the issue of taste. For instance, my taste may be constructed through one kind of training, and your taste may be constructed through another kind of training. And what appears to Pirsig to be pre-intellectual is probably not actually pre-intellectual, but rather something which is conditioned by the already intellectually structured taste of a person, literary taste of a person. So again, we have to come back then to the issue of social positionality. Okay, so what kind of social position do I have? What kind of training do I have? What kind of taste? What kind of political and social history is responsible for the construction of my literary taste, which might be different from the literary taste of another person. Okay, so that issue is of course there, but still we are, haunted by this question: is there really something which differentiates the good from the bad? Okay, and in a way, I think this is a very important issue, because if we don't do this, then there would be absolute relativism. So you will say there is no difference between journalistic literature and Shakespearean text. Of course, you are free to do that, but I think that also creates a problem for a person who studies literature and who probably, deep down, finds certain kinds of literature great. Okay, so this greatness at one level may be, culturally conditioned, may be conditioned by the historical forces, the material forces of cultural production. But at another level, there might be a genuine kind of, response to something which is good. And that's why I think when Leela Gandhi questions what she calls the sociologization of literature in affective communities, she has a point, even though, there is also a danger of falling into the trap of conservatism. Okay, and that danger is there in the case of the Western canon of Harold Bloom, and also in the case of affective communities by Leela Gandhi. Because see, what I'm basically trying to say is that in order to ensure the perennial appeal of a text, the text probably needs to be great, and probably in the ultimate test of literary excellence, our literary text will continue to be there as something immortal, something perennial, if there is something ingrained in it which is good, which is great. Okay, but this is something which it is very, very difficult to pinpoint, and that is what Pirsig said. I am talking about Pirsig, and I will be talking about Wisława Szymborska, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1996. They come up with almost the same kind of idea that what really makes a great piece of literature great is not something that you can easily pinpoint, because there is something unknowable about it. Okay, in a way it's unknowable, and it is, in a way, it is something which comes as a direct perception, or in the case of a creative writer, when he or she is creating something great, then it comes as something from within, over which one really doesn't have any control, or which one can't really rationally explain. Okay, so and that's why it's good to sort of move to a classic authors, because Szymborska is a Polish writer, and indeed she is a classic author. If you read Szymborska's poetry, you'll find that Szymborska's poetry is wonderful. It's just wonderful. So before moving to Szymborska, I would briefly mention a very interesting phrase from Hannah Arendt's Homo Faber, where she says that, from Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, where she comes up with the idea of Homo Faber. She says that the human being is basically Homo Faber. The human being is sort of characterized by its capacity for creation, for producing something. And she says that art creates a non-mortal home for mortal beings. Okay, so art is an oikos. It's a kind of home which is non-mortal, but it is created by mortal beings. Okay, so there is something paradoxical about great literature. There is a kind of essential ontological paradox about a classic text. That is, it is created by a mortal person, but it remains a non-mortal home for the generations to come. Okay, so, and if that is the case, then naturally there would be something which transcends mortality in art. Okay, and if that is the case, then there is really something metaphysical, something which we can't grasp. Okay, now it is possible to dismiss all kinds of metaphysics as ideological, as false consciousness or whatever, but still there does remain something. Okay, and to end this lecture, I would focus on two statements made by Szymborska. One is the statement that she made in her Nobel Prize lecture titled "The Poet and the World." And there she said, poets will have to keep saying, I don't know. I don't know where from this inspiration comes. I don't know how I write. Okay, so the very concept of Zensekoa. Okay, so I don't know. I mean, how this is coming to me, how this kind of creative excellence is emanating from me. So that's what the poet has to keep saying. And then I would end by reciting certain portions from her poem, The Joy of Writing. And when you listen to this poem, you'll find that there is a very interesting kind of similarity between what Arendt is saying and what Szymborska is saying. Okay. She says, is there then a world where I rule absolutely on fate? A time I bind with chains of signs, and existence become endless at my bidding. The joy of writing, the power of preserving, revenge of a mortal hand. So, according to Szymborska, art is the revenge of a mortal hand on the essential mortality of the human race. Okay, so she says that through art we also triumph over our essential, inescapable mortal condition. Okay, and in order to sort of have this revenge, you really have to be inspired by something whose the source of which it's not very easy to identify. Okay, so I would end by saying that I am personally I continuously oscillate between, on the one hand, this concept of classic as ideology, the concept of classic as something which is completely politically motivated. I do find some very important, some certain kinds of significance in that statement, in that position as well, because it's indeed true that certain kinds of literature become canonical because of the power structure. And even if you think about a really great piece of literature, you may say that that great piece of literature has become canonized due to certain social, political, and historical conditions. That's true. That's absolutely true. And that's why when you read Anne Miller's work on Romanticism, you find that she's saying that this canonization of the great male romantic poets is something which is conditioned by the patriarchal ideologies of that culture, of that period in Britain. So you can't really say that there was no other great writer. Okay, and she indeed excavates a lot of great writers, a lot of great female writers, poets, novelists, etc., from that phase. And she says that even we need to think about the non-poetic genres that flourished during the Romantic period in Britain. And she focuses on the women authors who wrote, novels or prose pieces and so on and so forth. So that's there. But on the other hand, I am also fascinated with this idea of Zensekwa. I am indeed fascinated with this idea that there is something metaphysical about the greatness of a great text. That there is indeed something which you can't probably pinpoint, you can't probably just rationally explain or even explain away. Thank you. Please put
Thank you.
forward.
Thank you, sir, for your illuminating and awestruck talk. Now the forum is open for the scholars and our students to ask questions. You may uh, uh,
Yeah,
ask
let
your
me.
question directly, or you may drop your question in the chat box.
Yeah,
Uh, Honorable Babu, can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you. There are certain
Uh,
questions. Let me
in the chat box. Yes,
in the
sir.
chat box. Yeah, can you kindly read out the questions as well? Because I mean, if you read out the question, then I can answer the question, so that actually I want everybody to hear the questions as well as the answers.
Okay, sir. The first question is from Debhargo Chakraborty.
Yeah.
He asked two questions. Do you think the concept of classic and ideology?
Yeah. Now, this is what I have already focused on. I mean, from one perspective, it can be seen as an ideology. There is no doubt about that, because as I have said, it does reflect the concept of class division. It does reflect the concept of a hierarchy, a socio-political hierarchy. So that's there. And indeed, you can't say that a classic automatically becomes a classic just by virtue of its literary excellence. Of course, a lot of other factors are also involved in its construction as a classic. The construction of a classic as such, for instance, the literary establishment of that time, the power structure of that time, the literary market, as I just focused on, because the literary market is very important. Okay, if you think about the pre-modern times, then probably there were other kinds of establishment which would which would lend the classic status to a classic, quote unquote classic. For instance, there was the patronage system, there was the system of say friend circles. Okay, the literary friends, I mean the literature friends of one particular literature, so the writers club, so to speak. And today, of course, but the problem is that when I find, on the other hand, and here I think there is some merit in what Harold Bloom says, or what, say, Leela Gandhi says, that today I find that everyone is capable of writing a classic. Okay, and I have some kind of trouble with that. I mean, when I am sort of choked by a plethora of classics. Okay, so every day someone is reading a classic on Facebook, every day someone is reading a classic in the newspaper. Everyone is saying that if you have some kind of clout in the literary establishment, even if you have certain kinds of friends in the journalistic sector, then you can easily become a classic overnight, because people would say you are wonderful. But the problem is that this kind of ephemerality, this kind of fleetingness actually doesn't go well with the concept of the classic. Okay, so a classic is something which is conditioned by, I would say, which is conditioned by that very interesting statement by Tagore in one of his poems in Gitanjali, that time is endless in thy hands, O Lord. So I would say that if we don't believe that time is endless in the hands of certain forces, and that endless time would ultimately determine what is a classic, and not the market forces, not the sort of big publishing houses, then probably we can say that the concept of classic, the older concept of classic, can also operate as something which would resist this kind of all devouring force of the market economy. Okay, because whether we know it or not, whether we want to sort of accept it or not, the fact is that today everything is determined by the market. Okay, So if you think about the literary prizes, there are the market forces which are working behind them. There are certain, and whenever we are thinking about literature today, we are basically thinking about marketable literature. So I have a trouble with the concept that anything that is marketable is a classic. Okay, I have a trouble with that concept because on the one hand, of course, when you release the concept of the classic from its hierarchical and politically conservative framework of understandings, then it's fine. I would say that that kind of perspective is liberatory. But on the other hand, if you fall into the trap of this kind of market oriented or market dominated construction of new classics, or or the dissolution of the concept of the classic altogether. For instance, there are some critics who are saying that the concept of classic is associated with conservatism or even fascism. For instance, Pendergast has actually said that the Saint-Beuve's concept of the classic that had some kind of connection with the rise of right-wing politics in France, etc. And he says that, in fact, we need to question the very idea of the classic, okay, as an ideology, indeed as an ideology. So that's fine. I agree with that. But the problem is that we need to understand the other side of this phenomenon, So it's not really a kind of dichotomy between, on the one hand, classic as an ideology and an endless kind of possibility for literary fruition or literary voices, because the literary voices are still edited, dominated, excluded by the market forces. So it is not really the case that when we jettison the concept of the classic, we immediately become more egalitarian or sort of more open to the literary voices coming from different sectors, because the politics of excluding voices, the literary establishment, are always there. So it's not that they were there only in the times of Homer or Shakespeare and they are not there in our times. Okay, rather, if you say that there is no necessity for the concept of a classic, then you are probably sort of shifting the agency for determining literary excellence completely to the market, and that would be disastrous for not just culture but also for kind of liberatory politics. That's my take on it. Okay, then the second question is, who should decide if it's classic or not? Is it going to be decided by the classic writers or by the common readers? What do you think? Yeah, this is again a problem, and that's why I said that whenever we talk about this issue of a classic, we are faced with aporias. For instance, if we say that the common readers will determine what is a classic, then God forbid, most of the classics, most of the texts which are sort of voraciously read by the common readers would qualify as classics, and that would be again disastrous. Okay, and here we need to understand that it is not just a kind of binaristic system where you have a relation between the writers and the common readers. There are a lot of factors which are there between the reader and the writer. Okay, for instance, the market is there. The very medium through which the writing of the author is reaching the reader. That is very important. Okay, it's very important to understand that. So we need to understand that probably there is no definition, no possible definition of a classic. Okay, and in that case, as I said, probably it's only, I won't call it a solution, but the only possible way to understand whether our text is a classic or not is to let it, pass the test of time. But again, the problem is that that is something which can never be done within a synchronic context. For instance, if I write a book today, I can't say whether it's a classic or not, because I will have to release it into the diachronic sort of context of its existence. So that's why probably the best way to sort of define a classic is to look at the dynamics of its afterlife. That would be my take on it. Okay, because if it has had a very significant afterlife, then whether it's the common reader or the community of writers or the community of critics, intellectual readers, whatever, we have to understand that there is some kind of integral consensus regarding regarding the perennial appeal of the text. Okay, but it is something which can be done or tested only diachronically, and that is a problem. Okay, so I would say that the concept of the classic is a problem, and there is no solution to it.
Then there is next question by Mohua Bhattacharya. Her question is, what are the things one should keep in mind while adapting themes from the classic?
Now, here again, I would say that there is no sort of clear-cut answer to this. For instance, if you think about the film adaptation now of a text made by any filmmaker, you will find that it actually depends on, to a great extent, it does depend on the personal choices, the personal predilections of the filmmaker, the person who is adapting the classic in theater or cinema. In the case of theater, it's a theater director. But I would say that some kind of, some kind of similarity, some kind of overlapping, some kind of, central, what I'm trying to say is that the person who is adapting the literary text to the theatrical or the cinematic medium should try to be at least to some extent faithful to the original text, because he or she needs to understand that there might be viewers who have not read the original. Okay, and when I am adapting a text, I need to understand that I am also, at least to some extent, burdened with the responsibility to convey the message of the author to my audience. What happens in most of the cases is that the filmmaker as an author, suffers from some kind of ego, when he or she sets out to make an adaptation of a classic text. He or she believes that he or she does have the right to sort of adapt it in the way they choose. But the problem is that it's just like translation. When you are translating a text, of course, you can take a lot of freedom. And there are a lot of translation theorists who are actually ready to accept that the translator is supposed to have that kind of freedom, a huge amount of freedom. But the translator also has the responsibility to convey the message of the author to the readers. In a similar way, here too, I think that there should be some kind of, faithful adaptation, some kind of fidelity, because otherwise the non-informed audience might think that what the film says is also the message of the author. So what I am basically trying to say in this context is that when the filmmaker or even the translator is reinterpreting the text written by an author, he or she needs to understand that he or she is not just a creative artist, but also a communicator. So here there is also a function of communication, literary communication, but also basic cultural communication and linguistic communication. For instance, if I write a poem where I am, criticizing racism, and you are translating that text and you are translating it in such a way that it appears I am not really critical of racism, then there is a huge problem. Okay, so we need to understand that as far as the creative freedom is concerned, it's fine. There should be a lot of freedom given to the filmmaker or the translator. But as far as the communicative aspect is concerned, I think some kind of communicative fidelity should be maintained. Okay, and as far as the themes are concerned, it depends on the predilection of the filmmaker. One particular theme may appeal to one filmmaker and another theme may appeal to another.
Her next question is, how we should read the adaptation of classic in the theater or cinema? Is the judgment always done to the classic while adapting?
Yeah, that's why I said that there is not always justice done to the classic, because see, when you adapt a classic, if you are too much preoccupied with your own ideology, ideological position or say your own take on that text, then your voice as an interpreter would dominate the voice of the author himself or herself. Okay, and that's a problem. It's really good that every filmmaker or every translator, it's also true about the translators, literary translators, that they do interpret literary text in a new way, in a unique way. Everyone does that. That's fine. But the problem is that a translator or a filmmaker does have the responsibility to convey the message of the classic to the audience as well. Okay. So so it's very simple. It's like reporting a speech. Suppose you had told Mr. X that you don't like eating say a certain kind of sweet, and if I say when I report that speech to someone else, if I say that he or she told Mr. X that he or she actually likes a lot eating this particular kind of sweet, so there would be a trouble. Okay, so it's also like that. When I am working with someone else's text, then it is my responsibility to convey the message that that particular person had tried to convey to the audience, because that's what I'm trying to do. Otherwise, I could have written a text of my own. Okay, I could have just said that I am writing a text which is based on this. So it's not an adaptation, but rather it is a recreation. Okay.
There is another question from one of our student Argha Kamal Guharai. His question is, for what reason did the people of the Renaissance era get back to the classic era and invented the neoclassicism era in literature?
Yeah, now see, actually during the Renaissance, people got back to the classic era because they found something something robust in that classic culture. Actually, I can't answer this question in detail here, because that would take a lot of time. If you look at the construction of the Renaissance as a cultural movement in the West, you find that it has often been observed that it was a kind of resurrection of the classical culture, but actually that was not the case. If you closely look at the continuum of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance times, you will find that the classical culture was always there. It kept getting reinvented by authors during the Middle Ages as well. For instance, Chaucer was working on this, and then there were many other writers who were working on this. But during the Renaissance, people sort of got back to the classical period and found something extremely interesting and extremely energizing in the classical culture. Okay, but that doesn't mean that it was just a kind of aesthetic choice. So in a way, I would say, actually, my personal opinion is that it was also a way of appropriating the cultural past of Europe as one's own. Because if you closely look at the dichotomy involved in the Renaissance cultural ideology, you will find that they were trying to appropriate something which was not Christian from a Christian perspective. Okay, so on the one hand, there was the classical culture, which was pre-Christian, and it had a very different kind of ethos. And on the other hand, there was this Christian Europe, which was trying to reinvent, rejuvenate its cultural idioms by appropriating those idioms and adapting them to the Christian culture. So there was also some kind of mismatch. Okay, and I would say that it was not just about going back to that classic era. It was also about some kind of what I would like to call a kind of misreading of the classical culture in various ways. For instance, if you think about the the concepts of early modernity that were emerging during the times of the Renaissance, you will find that there was a focus on the individual in many ways, though that's not universally the case. But nevertheless, there was this emergence of the incipient, bourgeois individual. But in the classical times, on the other hand, you had a very interesting and a very robust, very meaningful treatment of the relationship between the individual and the community. Okay, I think what, I mean, this is my personal observation. I think what was interesting about the classical era, as far as the Renaissance people were concerned, was that there was in the classical times a more interesting framework of the correspondence and interaction between the individual and the community than what was there in medieval Christian Europe. You know, so that is what appealed to them, I think. Okay. And when you come to the neoclassical era, again you find that there was a focus on the classical style as the greatest style. So there was a lot of focus on imitation, but it was not just a kind of revival of the Western classical period. Okay, the neoclassical era, unfortunately, tried to freeze the process of literary production in many ways. Okay, of course, it did talk about genius, it did talk about the creative excellence, the imaginative power of a person, etc., etc. But the problem is that it also, to some extent at least, tried to freeze the creative, tried to create certain templates, certain models. Okay, and the problem is that the classical writers were not really following such templates. The templates come before the classic masterpieces. For instance, it's not that Oedipus was following certain certain templates. Okay, rather it has often been said that they did take a lot of freedom. For instance, if you think about Euripides was moving away from what the other dramatists were doing at that point of time. Okay, so so that's why I'd say that it was mainly about, probably, again, there are many other reasons, but I would say that there was a connection between the classic, the construction of the framework of interaction between the individual and the community in the classical times, and the framework of the relationship between the individual and the collectivity that you had in the Middle Ages. So they tried to sort of negotiate with those ancient forms of participation, meaningful participation of an individual in the political affairs of the state. Okay, so, and that's why Hannah Arendt talks a lot about praxis. She says that if you look at the ancient Greek texts, you find that the focus is on the political action. So you as an individual are able to actively participate in the political processes. Okay. Of course, there were certain limitations. For instance, the states were not allowed to do so, the women were not allowed to do so, but nevertheless, there was a somewhat liberal, more liberal ambience, and many Renaissance writers actually thought that there was a more liberal structure in ancient times. Okay. Even though I am not claiming that all of them had read the classic cultures properly. In fact, there are a lot of misreadings, and there are also a lot of slippages between the classic culture as it really was and the Renaissance culture as it perceived the classic culture, because as I have already mentioned, there was a fundamental difference between the polytheistic cultures of the classical period and the monotheistic Christian culture of medieval Europe. Okay, so the negotiation was there. Okay. And they also thought that it was a more sort of powerful, more resourceful, more virile culture. So that kind of idea was also there, and it has been suggested by many scholars that the Renaissance era intellectuals actually tried to reach up to that level of that kind of virility, that kind of robust cultural expression. But nevertheless, there was some kind of quote unquote infirm glory, as Shukadeva Chaudhary puts it. Okay, then the next question is politics of canon formation, the issue of young adult literature that is gaining mass popularity, but still when one comes to academia, one is made to feel shame to speak about it. Why this is so? I'm particularly talking about, okay, writers like Chetan Bhagat, Durjaya Datta, Navaneel Chakraborty, and yes, to some extent, Kunal Basu too, who was very feel shame to speak about all this. Okay, now see, it's not really about feeling shame to speak about all these things. My only point is that it's probably sort of problematic to identify these writers as classics. That's a real problem that I have with these writers. Okay, when we talk about canons in today's context, we find alternative possibilities of canon formation. For instance, there are different kinds of contextual canons, okay, which emanate from the very principle of cultural relativity. For instance, we are nowadays talking about the canons of minority literatures. Okay, we are talking about the canons of, say, as you have put it in your question, the canons of young adult literature. Okay, but I would say that there is a difference between what can be identified as a classic from such a contextually constructed canon and what is just included in that canon, but nevertheless, I mean, doesn't qualify as a classic. And another interesting thing is that when we think about certain writers, for instance, Chetan Bhagat. I mean, I ask many of my students whether they read Chetan Bhagat or not. Now they say no, we are not really fond of Chetan Bhagat. So I'm surprised because they are IIT students, so they're supposed to be fond of Chetan Bhagat. But then they say something very interesting, and I found that very interesting. In fact, some students told me, sir, we are in an IIT, so why the hell should we want to read some literature which is about IIT? We would like to read about something which deals with something else, some other kind of context, other kind of cultural context, or other kind of existential context. So the point is that it's not about feeling shame. They are part of one canon, but I would like to say that it is a kind of contextual canon. If we say that the Oedipus Rex and a novel by Kunal Basu can be placed on the same spectrum, then there is a trouble. Okay. And if you say that this trouble emanates from some kind of conservative assumption about culture, then again that's a problem, because what is good and what is bad, what is great and what is good. For instance, there is also a difference between what is great and what is good. Okay, so if as students of literature, as scholars of literature, we are also trained to sort of understand what literary excellence is, to intuit literary excellence, and I would say that that is something which is also a skill. I mean, you may call me a conservative in this context, but I would say that that's also a skill which we need to adopt. For instance, if you think about a doctor's skill, then that is a clinical skill. A doctor needs to diagnose a patient rightly. In the same way, probably, we need to sort of intuit literary excellence. That doesn't mean that we should exclude certain texts, or that we should not talk about that we should feel ashamed of liking those texts. So that's not the case at all, because even the most sophisticated literary scholar would be reading pulp literature, pulp fiction. So that's not the point. But the point is that there should be some kind of intuitive understanding of the quality. And that's why I focused on P6 idea of quality as well. Quality is not definable properly, through any kind of language, critical language, but nevertheless, that does matter. Okay. Deconstruction implies sometimes endless supplement in case of reading texts. Then should we revive the classical practice of Shruti and Smriti and thereby resist epistemological colonization? Yeah, now this is the answer to Nilanjana Ghosh's question. As deconstruction implies sometimes endless supplement in case of reading texts, then should we revive the classical practice of Shruti and Smriti and thereby resist the epistemological colonization? Now, see, I would say that yes, in India we had a hermeneutic tradition which had both similarities with as well as differences from the Western traditions of hermeneutics. And we do need to appreciate the Indic traditions of hermeneutics as well as the Western traditions. Unfortunately, the Western traditions of hermeneutics, the Western traditions of textual interpretation, whether the interpretation of a literary text or a religious text, that tradition has enjoyed hegemony in the global academia because of the colonization that has happened throughout the world. But I think that a very productive dialogue or even polylogue between the Indic hermeneutic traditions and the Western ones can be fruitful, because and that can actually create some new formats of interpretation that can also probably sort of tell us something interesting about what is accurate, what is not accurate, what is justifiable, what is not justifiable in terms of hermeneutics. Because in India, as opposed to the public perception, actually we have had a hermeneutic tradition that has always been grounded in differences of opinions, in different interpretative sort of traditions. For instance, the way Shankaracharya interpreted the Upanishads was not the way, say, Ramanuja interpreted the Upanishads. Okay, that was not the case. So there were significant differences between their interpretations, and I think this culture of multiplicitous interpretation is something which we need to celebrate. Then Ray, of course, reading literature and reading a philosophical and critical text, they are different, because when you read a philosophical or critical text, you are not basically dealing with a kind of imaginative universe. Apparently, you are getting the ideas of that philosopher or the critic, which is the ideas which are not mediated by any kind of imaginative factor or any kind of imaginative world making. But I would also say that the process of reading is not really very different always. For instance, there are philosophers who have read philosophical texts in the way a reader of literature would read a literary text. Okay, so there are also overlappings between reading literature and reading philosophical or critical text. And when we talk about literature, we also need to think about non-fictional literature. That's also literature. Yeah, so when the text is anonymous or the author writes with a pseudonym, we should focus mainly on the text. I am not saying that there should be a focus, even when the writer is writing under his real name. I am not going to say that there should be a focus on the biography of that author. Okay, that is not really so important. Okay, the text is important. So when we talk about the classics, there is also a different, a kind of confusion regarding the status of the classic, whether the classic is the classic author or the classic is the classic text. And more often than not, they are sort of confused. But I think we have to focus mostly on the classic text itself. For instance, we really don't know who Homer was or Vyasa was. So, but nevertheless, what they wrote was classic literature. Okay, now Rohit Mahathir's question is that when you have the adaptation and comparison of classical text with the modern ones, then you have a power structure, and in modern texts like Ulysses or Moby Dick, the classical texts are parodied, but nevertheless, the same power structure of the dominance of the classical over modern is there. Now, see, that's not always the case, because sometimes the modern authors also try to put forward a new model of morality, a new model of aesthetics. For instance, sometimes they try to question the very idea that the ordered universe of a classic text, or the order, the obsession with ordering that you find in what passes off as a classic, they often say that that kind of order making is not really good. We need to question that, and that's why Umberto Eco has said that in Ulysses you find an aesthetics of chaosmos. Okay, so it's both chaos and cosmos. Okay, so they try to complexify the structure of a classical text when they adopt that classical text, and they try to look at, and that's why I would say that in the case of Moby Dick or Ulysses, you don't really have just a mocking or parody, such as you find in the mock heroic genre, but rather here you have something which is, which is innovative and which tries to integrate the concept of chaos and the concept of chaos, cosmos. Okay, so order and disorder both get intermingled. How an intermediate text can be read and interpreted. So for that, you need to know the modalities of these different media. Okay, so for instance, you need to know about the ways of interpreting a literary, interpreting a text written in the literary medium, and you also need to know the way to sort of interpret a text that is produced in the cinematic medium. Okay, so some kind of intermediate understanding, some kind of intermediate interpretative expertise is also important, because if I am not a film studies expert, then probably I would end up misunderstanding and misinterpreting a film text. How the modern text can be judged by literary canon? Yeah, I mean, the classic answer would be probably the answer given by Eliot, T.S. Eliot, that the literary canon has a history of its own. So you have to contextualize the modern text within that long history of literary excellence, and it is probably that that age-old or even century-old context of literary excellence, which can sort of determine whether a text is excellent or not. But again, I would say that here, again, the problem is that there is actually no objective criterion for judging literary excellence. Okay, so it would be wrong to believe that there is anything which is objective, even though you may say that there is something that will remain subjective. And that's why I focused on this concept of Zensetua, something which you can't really rationally expect. Should we read the book first and then watch the movie? Now, it depends. Sometimes you can watch the movie first and then read the book, and then you can find something more interesting in the book than what is there in the movie. It depends, and there are different contexts of watching the film or reading the book. Okay. Is the identity of a classic sometimes determined by its intertextuality through ages? Yeah, it's true. It's true. In fact, it's a good observation. I would say that this is a very good observation. You can say that the classic is probably something which constructs itself through its sort of intertextual connection with the entire tradition, with the entire literary tradition. But again, there is a little bit of caveat, that is just a kind of intertextual connection would not make a classic a classic. Okay. So, but yes, it's true that this concept of intertextuality or multiple voices, both on the diachronic axis and the synchronic axis, that is very important for understanding the classic. Is there any other question?
Is there any question in YouTube, Janto?
No,
Probably there
no
is.
question from no YouTube.
Oh, there is no question in from YouTube. Okay. This is a very interesting interactive session. Now I request Pratik Pradhan of Agra SSB College to deliver words of thanks. Pratik, over to you.
Good afternoon. This is Pratik Pradhan, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Agra Association College. First of all, I would like to thank our resource person, Dr. Anna Mukhopadhyay, who has managed his busy schedule and has given his kind consent presented to deliver his speech to enrich us with his erudition. Well, sir, it was indeed a comprehensive and insightful sort of approach towards the idea of classic, and I think that all of us the lecture has been of immense help to all of us to understand the concept of classic in a way better way than the idea that we earlier had. Thank you very much, sir, and hope we might have several other interactive associations in future. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. I also look forward to meeting all of you, in some other time, probably in some better point of time, at some better point of time. We are all going through this kind of pandemic, which is a very bad thing. So let's hope that this trouble, gets over soon. Okay,
Yes,
so I
sir.
thank all of you and I take leave of you. Okay?
Yes, of course, sir. Of course.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.